Welcome to the Distinguished Lecture Series. I'm Karen Matthews of University Video Communications. Our program is designed to enrich graduate and upper division curricula with academic presentations by top computer scientists from industry. Its speakers and topics were nominated by computer science faculty of more than 50 universities. This presentation is sponsored by the Higher Education Marketing Group at Apple Computer. Dr. Alan Kay, a pioneer in computer-human interaction, received his PhD in computer science from the University of Utah in 1969. He joined the Artificial Intelligence Project at Stanford, and in 1970 became a founding principal of the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, where he remained for 10 years. After Xerox, he was chief scientist at Atari. Since 1984, Alan has been an Apple Fellow with the charter to explore new ideas for Apple's future. His talk today is Doing with Images Makes Symbols, Communicating with Computers. It's our pleasure to introduce Dr. Alan Kay. Alan?
Thank you. This is a talk about the only computer most of us ever see, the one that's acted out on the stage of the screen, called the user interface design. User interface in many ways is a second stage of development after the operating system, because the operating system, as we all know, was a layering of software that tried to turn a sometimes poorly designed machine into one that was more fruitful for the software environment. The user interface tries to do the same thing. It tries to design a special kind of machine that's very understandable, very efficient for the person who uses it without removing any of the things that the machine can actually do. This talk is too short to include all of the people that contributed to user interface over the years. I'm just going to pick out a few that particularly struck me along the way and illustrate it by means of examples. So in order to get started, let's go back 25 years to what must seem like the Pleistocene age for most people in universities today, to the dawn of some very important ideas. And first was the very first personal computer, which you see on the slide here. This is a machine called the Link. It was designed at Lincoln Labs in 1962 by Wes Clark, and it's my vote for the first personal computer ever done. You see it has a display and a keyboard, and it has some funny little things that look like deck tapes, but were actually originally designed for this machine. And one of the design criteria for this machine was it was supposed to be small enough on the desk so that a person could see over it. So one of the ideas is that this machine should not be intimidating. And about 2,000 of these were built in the 60s, mostly for biomedical technicians who didn't have a mainframe at their disposal and didn't want to hire programmers to use it. They wanted something that they could build, set up experiments themselves, do their own programming. And remarkably, a very large number of the original 2,000 are still in use today, 25 years later. The reason is that, among other things, nervous systems of animals haven't sped up in those years, and so a computer that worked very well back then for doing neurological experiments works very well today. Something else was happening at Lincoln Labs in 1962, and that was the invention of computer graphics. Ivan Sutherland's Sketchpad, probably the most significant single thesis ever done, a remarkable program in many ways even today, as we'll see by looking at this tape. This tape is from the very first movie of Sketchpad, taken in the summer of 1962. So this is 25 years old. Rubber bands you're familiar with, but look at what he's doing. He's pointing at the edges and saying, I want them to be all mutually perpendicular, and Sketchpad just figured out how to do that. Sketchpad is the first system to ever have a window. He's actually drawing on a virtual sheet of paper about 1/3 of a mile on a side. And again, to get something he wants, he simply sketches it in roughly and then gives rules like be parallel and perpendicular, and Sketchpad figures out and solves the problems. Here the rule is collinearity, so that the dashes lie directly over the guidelines below. The Sketchpad was able to solve very complicated problems in real time involving both linear and nonlinear systems of constraints. So it was the first non-procedural programming system and considerably more powerful than the spreadsheets of today. So he's made a hole in the flange, continuously zooms back. Now he wants to make a rivet, and again we see why it's called Sketchpad. He just draws a rough shape, uses the center of the crossbar there as the center of the arc, and then points to the edges and says, I want these to be mutually perpendicular again. Solving that forces the crossbar to change, which forces the arc to change, which gives you a perfectly symmetrical rivet. And he shows that no matter how you distort it, when he turns the problem solver on, it will come up with a symmetrical solution. And he could have made it more complicated. He could have constrained the side lengths to be ratios of each other, or tied to some other drawing in the environment. Now, another important idea seen here for practically the first time is that of master drawings and instances. He was working on a master drawing, and what he has here now is an instance of that. The instance can be rotated and scaled and positioned. So he's going to insert the rivet in the hole. By the way, the Sketchpad was the first system in which it was definitely discovered that the light pen is a very bad input device. So the blood runs out of your hand in about 20 seconds and leaves it numb. And in spite of that, it's been reinvented at least 90 times in the last 25 years. Here's another instance of the rivet, another one. Now, display is jumping around like that because they didn't even really have computer displays back then. The TX2 is putting up every dot by brute force. He didn't like the cross pieces, so he goes to the master drawing, makes them transparent. Lo and behold, we see dynamically that the rivets, the instance rivets, have felt that change. So Sketchpad is also the first object-oriented software system. And I once asked Ivan Sutherland, how could you possibly have done the first interactive graphics program, the first non-procedural programming language, the first object-oriented software system all in 1 year? He said, well, I didn't know it was hard. It's nothing like this before. And here he's showing that every instance that you make of something, every master can create instances. So he's making a bunch of copies of the hole in the flange. Now, I'd like to tell you where you could go to buy a system as good as Sketchpad, but I don't know where, because there isn't anything like it even on the market today 25 years later. It was a one-of-a-kind thing. It ran on a machine much larger than the studio that I'm recording the talk on. In fact, it was the last computer large enough to have its own roof in the United States. That mammoth machine had all of 460K bytes and executed about 400,000 instructions per second, which meant that this machine, this supercomputer of 25 years ago, was about the size of a 512K Macintosh. So what you saw there on the screen could be done on any of the desktop computers today, but nobody is doing it. Something we should think about just why. Now, moving ahead just a couple of years, we see another pioneer, Douglas Engelbart, the fellow who invented the mouse, the black-on-white display, and the first person to successfully implement hypertext, something that everybody is talking about today. And he did something else that was almost obscene even by today's standards. He actually went and studied his users. So he would poke around in people's offices and see the way people actually worked in offices. And he discovered something funny, that even after 16 years of schooling, that people wouldn't sit hunched over their desks the way they'd been taught. Think of it, a tremendous failure in American education. 16 years of being taught to sit hunched over a desk, and people would still scoot around in their office chairs and put their feet up on their desk and so forth. And Engelbart said, well, why the heck should we make people hunch over their desks to use their personal computers? Why not build something into the, in this case, it's a lap board that's built into the arm of the chair, so as the person moves around the room and does all the things they're used to doing with their chair, he is able to also use his computer navigation equipment. Here's an example of Engelbart's system as of about 20 years ago, in a live demonstration from San Francisco, he is sitting in San Francisco in an auditorium with about 3,000 people, and his group and the machines and the rest of the paraphernalia are in Menlo Park, about 35 miles away.
The program that I'm going to describe to you is quickly characterizable by saying, if in your office you as an intellectual worker were supplied with a computer display backed up by a computer that was alive for you all day and was instantly responsive, instantly responsive to every action you had, how much value could you derive from that? Well, this basically characterizes what we've been pursuing for many years in what we call the Augmented Human Intellect Research Center at Stanford Research Institute. So look what else we can do in here. I've got this file that's structured. If I want to see what's in there, I can walk down the hierarchy levels and see, or return. But there's another thing I can do. There's a root I said I have here. So here, I'm afraid I'll need a different picture of the view. So here's what I drew with a picture drawing capability here. It's a slight map if I start from work, and here's the route I seem to have to go to pick up all the materials. And that's my plan for getting home tonight. But if I want to, I can say, the library, what am I supposed to pick up there? I can just point to that, and oh, I see, overdue books and all. Well, there was a statement there with that name on it. Go back. What am I supposed to pick up at the drugstore? I see, very interesting. All right. Market? Oh, I've already seen that. Produce, no, like that. Gee, that's too much. Anyway, so we have this feature of structuring our material hierarchically, being able to move around it very well. When we get a hierarchy, such as I can show you here now, I can do things if I want to just say, I'd like to interchange produce and canned materials. Bingo. And they're all numbered rightly if I care to look. Interchanging them very quickly. Cans are going to get interchanged with produce. They do it and all gets renumbered. So I have ways of studying over, making different views, moving around, going to specified points, and modifying the structure. At the same time, I've seen that I have a repertoire of different entities, like character, knock off that character, replace the character, make that P. So I have entities of all sorts that I can say I want to do operations on, and this basic structure that I can move over and study and get about very quickly. So that is the essence now. That's the essence of the tool we have. There are a lot of details that I've left out for you. And that's very good feedback. Here are characters that show me the different viewing parameters, view specs. They get large at times at which I can hit single strokes that change those view parameters. And each of those means something to me, and their being large at particular times tells me I can hit very quick abbreviation for changing a view. So I can say, all right, I'd like to go to produce, but I'd like to go to produce, they get big, I'd like to say one branch only, and let me look just that low, and I see it. Oh, I can say, I'd like to see one line only. I can see it. So these ways I move around, the way I get feedback up here, the way I use both hands to coordinate to tell the computer what command and what short literals I want, are all carefully designed to go together to make the repertoire. I'd like to link to Bill, and I don't know what his terminal is right now, so I have to ask for somebody to connect me to him audibly. I'd like to link to Bill, and I don't know what his terminal is right now, so I have to ask for somebody to connect me to him audibly. So Bill, will you come in through this intercom?
Hello, Doug.
Hi. I need to know what terminal you're on, Bill.
13.
Okay. I'd like to have him see my text. And so this special thing, if I label 13, will switch over. So in his display, he sees my text, so I'll execute it. And sure enough, it does. But what's that running around? Well, if he's looking at my text, he'd like to have something to say about it. So we put on a marker, a tracking spot that he controls. So he's sitting in Menlo Park looking at this text, and he can point to it. But we've carefully reserved for me the right to control and operate on this. So my bug is more powerful than yours. But we can have an argument. Yeah. That's what they call a bug fight. So, all right. So in case you haven't been listening, Bill, we've been going through lots of examples and setting up in collaboration here so that we can go on into information retrieval. And we've set up now audio coupling, and we're both looking at the same display, and that'd be very handy to work. We can talk to each other and point, and maybe later I can hand you the chalk on this blackboard, like saying, here, you control it. But let's status mode now and add another feature that hardware-wise is available to the kind of display we have. I'd like to see you while I'm working on it. So before I can do that, I have to set up my display in a certain way. Set it up so I see it over like that. That leaves a corner up there, and I say, now computer, do the automatic switching that'll bring in a camera picture from the camera mounted on his console, such as the camera mounted on mine is. Hi, Bill. That's great. Now we're connected audio. You can see my work, you can point at it, and I can see your face, and we can talk. So let's do some collaborating.
So Engelbart had a complete vision of what this was going to be like years before all of the rest of us. And the vision included not just some of the ideas about how people were going to react and interact with the machine, but also that since people aren't natural-born hermits, in fact, we're all really communications junkies, Engelbart realized that any kind of a user interface design must include person-to-person collaboration through the medium of the machine. And so as the very first set of ideas that they had, it wasn't just how you organized your information in forms of n-dimensional hypertext, but how you could share it, how you could do something much more than electronic mail, but be able to do direct contact, sharing the information, being able to point, being able to talk to each other, and being able to see each other. We might compare that with the very fragmentary vision of the current day micro industry, which is just struggling over decades to try and reach the vision that Engelbart had almost in a complete form as early as 1962. Another thing that's interesting, if we look at the setup here of the mouse in one hand, a regular keyboard in the center, and a 5-finger keyboard on the left hand, we see something that was a very good idea, and we may have noticed something that was also a bad idea. The very good idea, Engelbart realized that you really didn't want to spend most of your time going back and forth between the regular keyboard and the mouse, because you have to find the mouse, you have to find the keyboard, and so forth. Instead, Engelbart wanted to set it up so that you would spend a relatively long period of time in either of those two ways of doing things. Either you'd be typing a paragraph of text, or you'd be doing lots of navigation and fixing single character errors and stuff. And so the 5-finger keyboard working with the 3-button mouse is a way of doing all the things that you could do with the keyboard. So you could stay for a very long time and never touch the regular keyboard. And then the thing that they missed, and they partially missed it because of the inaccuracy of the analog mouse, was the what we call modeless interaction, where you indicate the object first and then give the command. Because the mouse was inaccurate, what they would do in the command, instead of just hitting something like a word or a character or a paragraph and then saying something like move or going to some drag icon, they would have to go and say move word, then wait for a mouse click to indicate which word. And by what you said to move, like move word, move character, move paragraph, the program would know how fine to try and interpret the mouse coordinates it got. Then after it had picked the object, you then had to do a command accept. So in order to move something, you had to do 4 separate actions, which was quite inefficient, even though we'd already set up a more inefficient scheme than we use today for actually using the tools. Kind of an interesting paradox, but that's sort of the way it goes. Now, a few years later, 1967 time period. This is the first personal computer that I worked on, called the Flex Machine. Did it with Ed Cheadle. And this is a picture of it on its own display. So by that time, we'd realized that we could build a desktop computer. And of course, this was a desktop computer for only very special kinds of desks, like those made out of steel. So it weighed well over 100 pounds. And it had two characteristics that were very noticeable. One of them was it was a tremendous coffee warmer. You know, these little black dual inline packages that hold silicon. The Macintosh has about 50 of them or so that makes up a Macintosh. Back then, you were lucky if you could get 8 or 16 gates in one of these DIP packages. And so this machine had about 700 of those and generated an enormous amount of heat and had a fan that was likened to a 747 taking off. The other thing that was very noticeable about the machine is that the user interface tended to repel most of the people that we tried it on. I was a designer of that interface, and I was really crestfallen that people regarded it somewhat the way you would if you lifted the lid on a garbage can and saw something moist and fuzzy down inside. Very puzzled as how could we put all this work into the machine. Had a very powerful interactive object-oriented language that I had derived from Simula. Very high-quality graphics. In fact, it had one of the very first gadgets called the clipping divider, done at the same time as Ivan Sutherland in Harvard, and then later brought out to Utah. Had a very large virtual screen that you could map onto the physical screen. It had multiple windowing, not overlapping windowing because it was a calligraphic display. Lots of good stuff, and yet it didn't fly with the people that we tried it with. And one of the insights as to why this was and what to do about it came from early contact in 1968 with Seymour Papert's logo work at Bridge School in Lexington, Mass. The whole idea of children being able to program on a device that up to now had been in what is called the glass house in industry. It's that big room with air conditioning and raised floor and so forth. The whole idea that this could be extended down into the world of a child just changed my whole conception about what it was. I went from thinking of it, as did Engelbart, as some sort of super vehicle, something akin to a car as compared to IBM's Pennsylvania Railroad. Went from thinking of it as that to something much simpler. I thought of it now as media, because cars we withhold from children until they're 18, though I don't know why. That's when they're most dangerous. But we still nonetheless think of waiting until they're 18. Media, we never think that way. Paper and pencil we want children to start using from the time they can grab a crayon. And so this work of Papert's was critical in our understanding of what was going on. Another thing that was going on at Lincoln Labs was the first iconic programming. It was done at Rand Corporation. The people who did the wonderful interactive programming language JOS was done for economists and other non-computer specialists at Rand who had to compute. And one of their complaints about, their only complaint about JOS was they said, hey, none of us can type. Can't you do something about that? So that led to the invention of the first data tablet. It was called the RAND tablet back then. And this system, from about 1968, called GRAIL, for Graphical Input Language.
This list of processes takes us back to the topmost level, where we may start to edit the flow diagram.
No keyboard whatsoever.
First, we erase a flow arrow, then move the connector out of the way so that we may draw a box in its place.
We recognized he wanted a box and made one.
The printing
Now it's
in the box
recognizing
is
his
being
hand
used
printing.
as commentary only in this case. The box is slightly too large.
Wants to change the
so we
size of the
change
window.
its size.
Here's where Macintosh window control came from, literally.
Then draw a flow from the connector to the box. Attach a decision element to the box and draw a flow from it to scan.
Notice that every
We then
command
erase the flow
is
arrows
not just
attached to the
iconic, but
process
also
into
analogic.
a new area, and move
By
the
that I
box to a
mean
new position.
that it looks like the thing that you want. So if you want to scrub something out, you scrub it out. If you want to draw a box, you just draw a box. It recognizes you want one, makes one the same size. Chop off a corner.
And label it subscan.
You want characters, you just make characters, and it recognizes those. There are no menus to reach to. You're always looking directly at where you're working. Now notice it missed the N at the end of subscan there. He saw it, he hesitated, but it's the world's first modalist system, so he's able to just go and change it without issuing any more commands. You see every command that's actually being issued, and they're all in the form of direct action.
Complete the diagram from scan to post.
What a remarkable system that was. And when I saw that, I felt, and used it for a half an hour in 1968, I felt like I was sticking my hands right through the display and actually touching the information structures directly. This is the first system I'd ever used, and practically the only one since that I'd call truly intimate. And it was this degree of intimacy that is so important in a user interface. I used to show this movie to my group at Xerox PARC every 3 months or so we wouldn't forget what we're trying to do. Another thing that we saw in 1968 was tiny 1-inch square first flat panel display done at the University of Illinois. And we realized it was only going to be a matter of years until you could put all of the electronics that we had in the Flex machine on the back of a flat panel display. You'd have something like this, which I later came to call a Dynabook. Back in 1968, when I made this cardboard model, I just thought of it as the machine of the future, and started thinking about what would it be like for millions of people to have one of these machines. And so the metaphor became the pencil. What would it be like to have something like this as extant in the world as pencil and paper? Could people actually use it? And the answer in 1968 and the early 1970s was no. So one of the ways I started thinking about answering the question is, since we'd failed at designing for adults, and I remembered a wonderful phrase of Marshall McLuhan's. He said, I don't know who discovered water, but it wasn't a fish. The idea is if you're immersed in a context, you can't even see it. So we decided to follow Seymour Papert's lead, and instead of trying to design for adults, we would try and see what this Dynabook of the future would be like for children, and then maybe hope that some of it might spill over into the adult world. So children were an absolutely critical factor here. And the first stuff I did in my notebook in 1970 was called Kitty Comp. And here's what it first looked like. It's going to be built out of a Sony Tummy Trinitron. And then Xerox PARC came along with some wonderful, almost open charter funding and a very interesting culture. These are the beanbags that were so famous at PARC. And one of the reasons we used them, we discovered that it was impossible to leap to your feet to denounce somebody once you sat in a beanbag chair, because you tended to sink into it further and further. So it had a way of relaxing people, and it was very good for design. And then we started experimenting. So we built this machine, which was a very, very high resolution way of displaying video images. And the first fruits of that was this font editor, the first font editor done by Ben Laws. And all of a sudden, you could get images like this. That it was quite possible to mimic the high-quality printing images on a bitmap display. We got very interested in that. Trying some of these ideas out on children, we discovered they didn't always like their, you might zoom in on that, they didn't always like to have their rough drafts look like they've been printed by the New York Times. So some of the children said, well, what we really would like to have for rough drafts is our own handwriting. So they used this font editor and put in their own handwriting. And that was a way of instantly telling when you looked at a document just how finished it was intended to be. And the bitmap display also allowed us to do sketching and drawing as well as crisp computer graphics. And again, one of the things that had not been possible before is doing real design on a computer. Before, people always designed on the back of an envelope and then brought the back of the envelope to the computer as a way to render it. But here what we'd hope for is that people would actually stay with the computer for the better part of the day. And we put a lot of effort into making this display be something that you could look at for 6 or 7 hours without eye strain. Next envisionment of this was a little system we called Minicom, and this was the summer of 1971. And we went to a considerable direction in thinking about making this. And then we also did some dynamic animation, as we'll see in a minute. Space War had a very important part in the design of things because it was a conceptually simple precursor of all of the video games we know today. It should be something that a child could write for himself. And we started working on Smalltalk, an object-oriented language based on Simula, but also with a lot of look back to what Sketchpad. Then all of this led to the Alto computer, built mostly by Chuck Thacker at Xerox PARC, the first workstation, and led to all of the subsequent workstations, and it also led directly to the Lisa and the Macintosh at Apple. We used an improved version of Engelbart's mouse, and in its early stages we call it the interim Dynabook. We brought lots of children into PARC to work on these machines, and then we took the machines down into the Palo Alto schools, working with several hundred children in all. Here we are at Jordan Junior High School around 1976. Now let's take a look at animated versions of some of the things that ran on this machine and some of the things that the children did. So here's the famous Dynabook model, and back then we wanted it to be like the Hewlett-Packard calculator, except to be a real live computer. This was the inspiration for all that we were thinking about as what it was going to be like. Here's Ben Law's font editor being used to make an A in Lydian cursive. Most of these are taken from home movies we shot with a 16mm Bolex. Here's the painting program. This is something I designed in the summer of 1972, and Steve Purcell implemented it. Here you see some hand character recognition. It recognized the letter C as a command for drawing circles. That was put in by John Schock. We were experimenting with this at the time. Here's an L for drawing lines. One of the nice things about hand character recognition is that you don't have to move very far to hit something. Here's a D for drawing. The idea of actually being able to fashion your brushes right in the combination of canvas and palette itself was something that Purcell thought up, I think. The idea of having charcoal and airbrush effects was something that was also added at the very beginning of this. And you get some charcoal effects. Here's some experiments with the very first experiments with windows, dragging them around by one corner, opening their size at the other corner, just like on the Mac today, making another one by going up to the upper right-hand corner, typing something in it, clipping the stuff that's inside. So I think this was the very first actual test, although of course we knew Windows were going to work, because there had been examples of Windows before. But this is the very first test of them on a bitmapped display and some experiments with the user interface, what they might be like to just manipulate them. here is one of the very first group of kids. I can tell that because there aren't even display covers on the display. We had to put in old cardboard boxes to keep the kids from getting electrocuted. And this is a group of, I think, 6th graders, 5th or 6th graders, and this is Adele Goldberg, who later went on to head the group after I left Park, and she was responsible for many of the ideas in teaching the children. We first did logo-like things in Smalltalk, such as this program, and we also experimented with animated windows. Here's the very first test of an animated window, which we later abandoned because the machine wasn't quite fast enough, but I still think it's a nicer way of doing it, where instead of getting just an open frame that moves, you actually animate all of the text itself and have it occlude the window. So this is the Alto screen in early 1973, not long after the Alto had first started to work. The Alto is actually a very powerful computer. If you could get to its microcode directly, we could. And the Alto is able to animate about 120 square inches of graphics in multiple planes. So you could do very complex 2.5D animation effects. And this is something done by Purcell, I think, around the end of 1973. And that was really the machine we thought we had. It was a machine that you could animate everything on it. Tying all that stuff together with Smalltalk, we got a number of interesting things with the kids. Here's one of the second level classes. This was a 13-year-old teaching 12-year-olds. And Marion had done one of the very first tools in Smalltalk the year before when she had learned it. And she was a very outgoing, ebullient young lady, and she wanted to teach a class. And so we brought in, we had 5 machines at the time, so we had 5 children, and we videotaped all of the 100 hours of it. And here's an example. This is from 1975 of a program that looks very much like MacDraw. It's an object-oriented graphics illustrator. You can select by means of selection handles. You can change colors. You can change the size. So the menu is being used on the lower right hand there, and the feedback is coming in the window in the center. And the only thing that's really interesting about this program is, besides that it was done in 1975, which is before you could buy it in a store, is it was actually conceived, designed, and implemented by a 12-year-old girl after only a few months of programming in Smalltalk. It took her about 2 weeks to do this, and the size of the program in Smalltalk 72 was about a page long. So part of our aim here was not just to get people to be able to access things by means of the windows, but also to be able to do the equivalent of writing short essays and having them have great effect. And one of the things that is disturbingly true about most novices on computers is that about 2 pages of program is the maximum they can handle. They like to be able to spread it out, use their visual field as an extension of their short-term memory. Here's another example. A 15-year-old boy, again after a few months of programming in Smalltalk 72, he was interested in ham radio, but really had gotten bored with the tedium of drawing radio diagrams, so he decided to make himself a ham radio illustrator, and has some quite sophisticated features. You see here a pop-up menu with often used things like open and close dots, and he has a more extensive menu of iconic shapes for the circuits down below, so he can pick up a battery symbol and rotate it and put it in. This is also done in 1975, and It's one of my favorite programs done by a child because less than 10 years before this, a PhD had been awarded for a system that wasn't as good. This program is about 80 lines of code long in Smalltalk 72. Now next, we have a program done by adults, but for the most part who had never programmed before. They were professional animators that came to Park in the summer of '74. And the thing that animators would like to do is to see whether their animations are going to work before they have to go to film. So that summer they devised a variety of systems, and this is what every animator would like to do, is draw the picture, reach over into the movie window, grab the thing you've just drawn, show it what to do, have it play back. Now, of course, it's not squishing when it hits, so it doesn't look quite real. So he goes to the steps there in the iconic menu. And when it gets down to the bottom here, what he's going to do is replace that with a fresh drawing that's going to come from another transparent cell that he overlays in the drawing windows on the right-hand side. So the drawing windows can have several transparent cells overlaid each other. He uses the old one for registration purposes. So he's now drawing on another cell, and that drawing will be inserted into the animation as the animation goes. And now the animator can see how much detail he has to put into that squash drawing before we see it as actually squashing. And he obviously has to at least put in the specular reflection on the ball. There he goes. And now we see it as a deformation, even though it's a one-frame change. That program is about 5 pages long, which is longer than children can actually do. But here's a 12-year-old girl that was very interested in horses. And so she spent some time getting the correct gait and animating a horse across the screen. But then she wanted a feature that the adult animators hadn't put in, and that was to be able to combine 2 animations into a single one. So she has the horse animation going over there, and here she has a jockey animation, and she wants to be able to pick it up, and in the act of actually combining, she wants them now to fuse into one drawing. This is a feature that she was able to put in herself, because even though she wasn't capable of writing a 5-page program like the adults, she was quite capable of reading it and making a change in it. And here's the finished animation. Now, what we've just seen are some things that are familiar to us now in this day of the microcomputer. We've also seen some things that people aren't yet doing. People don't usually sit down and do for themselves a complete tool like an Illustrator. They go to the store and spend several hundreds of dollars, and yet here we see 12-year-old children coming up with the idea and being able to implement it, and not only being able to implement it, but being able to implement it in a very compact form. Now, why is that, and why is this such an important part of computer literacy? Well, I think literacy has 3 important parts to it. There's an access part, and in the print medium we call that reading. Somebody else makes up the material, and we have the skills to penetrate that material and understand it. Access literacy. The second one is creative literacy. We don't think a person is literate if all they can do is read. We think they should be able to write. And the English language is powerful enough in its metaphor that we can do very strong expressions of our own intent in just a page or 2. We can start a revolution with 2 pages of well-couched prose. And programming languages just haven't been strong enough and easy enough to understand. But if we're ever to have computer literacy, it is going to have those 2 things as first-order attributes. And then the third thing in computer literacy is that for anything that we can be literate in, there is a literature. So when we read Shakespeare, we have to read Shakespeare with a completely different approach to the genre of the Elizabethan age than we do from reading Mickey Spillane. So throughout the many centuries in which the English language has existed, there are different genera that we have to be able to adapt to. And that's the third form of literacy, is genre literacy. And then the third thing in computer literacy is that for anything that we can be literate in, there is a literature. So when we read Shakespeare, we have to read Shakespeare with a completely different approach to the genre of the Elizabethan age than we do from reading Mickey Spillane. So throughout the many centuries in which the English language has existed, there are different genera that we have to be able to adapt to. And that's the third form of literacy, is genre literacy. In this talk, I'm concentrating mostly on the first two. And now I want to go and focus on why this stuff works and how we came to some of these design decisions. Of course, some of it was just haphazard and random. Some of it we rationalized after the fact. But some of it, we actually thought it through and were able to use stuff that had been done before. So to give you an idea of how difficult it is to understand how the mind works, let's take a look at this slide and see if we can see what's wrong with it. If you look at it for a while, you'll see that the mouth is somehow upside down. And maybe the eyes, something wrong with the eyes. Maybe they're upside down too. And if I were teaching in a school and trying to teach you about what had been done with this slide, I would say an English sentence like the following. I'd say, well, here we've taken a slide of a young girl, extracted her eyes and mouth, and put them back in with an airbrush, and then turned the entire slide upside down. That's an English sentence. And now that I've said that, you can understand everything about what it looks like when I turn it right side up. Now, I've given this talk many times, and I'm going to have to move it backward because I've discovered nobody will listen to me when that slide is on. And from the many times I've given the talk, I know that there were gasps in the classroom when you saw that picture because you weren't prepared for it, even though I told you everything about what had been done to it. Now, perceptual psychologists really love when something like this happens because it means that information going in through one channel, the auditory channel to your language processing centers, elicited one kind of response to my sentence, and when you saw the actual picture through your visual channel, it elicited a completely different response. And this is actually understood physiologically as well as psychologically. On the under right-hand side of your brain, where you do face recognition, there are two pieces of brain tissue about an inch apart. One of them is an expert at faces. It's a thing that allows you to see faces in clouds, the thing that scares children in twilight. They see menacing shadows. And it's reporting right now, I see an upside-down face-like thing. Then about an inch away is another piece of brain tissue that's an expert in eyes and mouth only. And it's saying, well, that's a good-looking mouth, and those are okay eyes. There's very little dissonance between the reports of these two separate pieces of brain tissue. Now, when I go to this right-side-up version of the thing, the face recognition guy is saying, well, that's a right-side-up face-like thing. And the eyes and mouth guy is saying, something is terribly wrong here. And you can imagine why nature might have arranged for you to be startled. Seeing a face like this up close might mean you're going to die in the next 10 seconds. And in fact, it is built into all mammals. Something that we don't learn but is in the mammalian nervous system. So if you try this on a dog, I suggest you pick a small one. So the basic idea here is that what we think of as the unitary I, the unitary I-ness of I, myself, and me, is really a multiple set of different mentalities that apparently came about during different evolutionary periods. The mentalities think differently. They don't communicate very well with each other. They're often in conflict, and only a few of them talk. So we're only aware of a few of them in what we call our consciousness. Most of what the other mentalities do we call our subconscious. But relegating everything to the subconscious is almost akin to mysticism. And in fact, there's a lot more to be learned about this area. And we got interested in three of these mentalities, first from the work of Jean Piaget, And Piaget said that he thought children and adults have a unitary mentality that goes through stages as the child matures. So Piaget said, first there is a doing stage where a hole is to dig it and an object is to grab it. Thinking is action in that stage. The child doesn't think ahead. He doesn't imagine the consequences of his action. He just does. Later on is the image stage, child of 5 or 6 or 7, who, for instance, when given a squat glass poured into a tall, thin glass, will say there's more water in the tall, thin glass. I think everybody is familiar with that experiment of Piaget's. And it's because the child is being dominated by the visual image. It looks like there's more water there, and so the visual logic says that there is. And then around 11 or 12, Piaget says that the child goes to a facts and logic stage, away from the immediacy of the visual environment, or at least in French children who are 11 and 12. There are less evidence that American children ever get into the facts and logic stage. Now, when we looked at Piaget's theory, it was interesting. What it seemed to say is that if the child is below the age of 5, say, you should only do muscular things, and if the child is in this age between, say, roughly 5 and 11, that you should do mostly visual things, and then above that you should do sort of symbolic things. And it just didn't come through with any ideas for us. But while reading about Piaget, we had found the work of Brune, who was the American psychologist who was one of the persons to bring Piaget to the American public's attention. And Brune had a more interesting theory, and it came about from experiments that he did to confirm what Piaget was talking about. So Brune did the experiment, took the water in the squat glass and poured it into the tall, thin one. The child said, yes, there's more water in the tall, thin glass. Then Brune did something that Piaget hadn't thought to do. Brune then covered up the glass. And the child said, oh, but wait, there must be the same amount of water, because where would it go? And then Brune revealed the tall, thin glass, and the child said, oh, wait, no, look, there's more water. And Brune covered it up again, and the child said, oh, there must be the same amount of water, because where would it go? So if you have any 9-year-olds you'd like to torment, this is a good way to do it, because what Brune was doing was jumping the child not from this mentality back to a previous stage, but he was showing, as he did in many experiments, the existence of multiple mentalities. So the child was normally visually dominant here, but if you occluded the visual field, then this fledgling symbolic mentality that was really going to be switched on in a stronger way later on could actually work. And from this, we got a lot of ideas. It suggested that there are ways of using some of these other mentalities. And we got some confirmation from some interesting work in the literature of creativity. One of them was by Jacques Hadamard, the famous French mathematician, who in the late stages of his life decided to poll his 99 buddies, the other who made up together the 100 great mathematicians and physicists on the Earth. And he asked them, how do you do your thing? And they were all personal friends of his, so they wrote back depositions. And only a few out of the 100 claimed to use mathematical symbology at all, which was quite a surprise. All of them said they did it mostly in imagery or figurative terms. And an amazing 30% or so, including Einstein, were down here in the mud pies. Einstein's deposition said, I have sensations of a kinesthetic or muscular type. Einstein could feel the abstract spaces he was dealing with in the muscles of his arms and his fingers. So one way of interpreting Hadamard's diagram here is that genius is the ability to recapture childhood at will. That's sort of the Piagetian way of looking at it. But a stronger way is to look at it through Bruner's eyes and see that what is actually going on is that these very creative people are somehow able to be in contact with other mentalities that are going on all the time. Now, this is a better way of thinking about this than in simply splitting things up into conscious and subconscious, or right brain and left brain. This notion that there are, each one of these things evolved for a different reason and can do different kinds of logics is very important. And we'll see why in a second. Now, I'm going to give you the most graphic demonstration I know of this principle in action, of what it means to actually be able to teach directly to the mentality that's going to learn rather than trying to teach through an inappropriate channel. You see, the sad part of Hadamard's diagram is that every child in the United States is taught math and physics through this channel, the channel that almost no adult creative mathematician and physicist uses to do it. And that is really a shame. They use this channel to communicate, but not to do their thing. And much of our education is founded on those principles, that just because we can talk about something, there's a naive belief that we can teach through talking and listening. Now, this example I'm going to show is taken from a television show in 1975 on Harry Reasoner's television show on ABC. And he had read a book that apparently upset him called The Inner Game of Tennis, which basically said almost anybody can learn to play a decent game of tennis in just a single afternoon if you don't try too hard. And that had made him wonder, because he'd been trying to play tennis for many years. And so he sent an ABC news squad out to California to expose this charlatan. And what they did was to round up a number of people and get them to sign legal affidavits saying that they had never played tennis before. They took them all out in the court and picked the worst one, who happened to be a 55-year-old lady, 40 pounds overweight, 5'2" and a muumuu. And she had the muumuu because her deposition said that not only had she never played tennis, but she'd not even exercised in 20 years. So taking them all in the court, turning on the live TV cameras, they set a clock and said to Tim Galway, you have 20 minutes to teach her how to play tennis. Now let's look at this from the standpoint of user interface design. Because in every way, Tim Galway is the user interface of this interactive teaching situation we have. And let's see what he actually does.
I'm going to have Tim hit some
This
balls
has
to
sound.
me. And as the ball flies through the air, I want you just to watch it. And the very instant the ball hits the court, I want you to say bounce. And the very instant the ball hits the racket, I want you to say hit. So you just be saying bounce, hit. All you need to do is watch the ball. Okay?
Bounce.
The key of all the exercises in the inner game is to focus the mind's attention somewhere where it will not interfere with the body's ability to hit the ball automatically. You stand here and Tim will throw you a couple, and you just continue doing the same thing.
Should I try to hit it?
Not at first. At first, just say bounce when the ball bounces and hit when you would hit it, but don't hit it. Then after you feel like hitting it, go ahead and hit it.
Okay.
Now you might watch her right arm
Bounce,
here.
hit. Bounce,
Something's trying to hit that ball,
Bounce,
even though she was told that she didn't have to.
Bounce,
Now when she actually
hit.
tries, she misses.
When it says bounce, he's also out of the corner of his eye watching me hit the ball. So even though he's not trying to see how I hit it, the image of me hitting it is going right into his memory. You enjoying yourself?
Yeah, it's really fun.
You like that? Okay, here we go.
I love it.
The cardinal principle in any book written on tennis, about
Yes.
tennis, is to watch the ball. No tennis player really sees the ball enough. And the reason is they get bored. So I try to give them something to see in the ball that's interesting. So we watch the trajectory of the ball, the gracefulness of the line made by the ball as it flies through the air. Always it's the same. Put the mind somewhere where it can stay calm and not get you uptight, but relaxed and interested. Then the body does so beautifully, so beautifully. I might start listening to the ball, Molly. Listen to how it sounds on your racket. Hear that?
Yes.
Hear that one? What did that sound like?
Very dull.
It was like wood. It's how wood sounds. Keep listening and you'll hear the sound that you like pretty soon. Just listen to it. Okay, now listen on this side. Now the girl. Okay. Now feel where that racket is part of your arm. That's it. Just feel it. Don't try so hard. Let it happen. That's it. Do what's comfortable, Molly.
Every time I did start to think, things went wrong.
Just feel the pace.
When you just stop thinking, the body seems to know what to do.
Can you feel with your left hand where it is? There you go. Just in the back there. Feel it. Okay. Now, I'll tell you what, Molly. We're going to do one other stroke now. And this one's called the serve. And the serve is just like a dance. You're just like a dance. We'll come back here and I'll show you how to do a dance called the serve. Okay? And I've done this dance a little bit, so I'll just do it. Okay. Da-da, da. In fact, you can start humming if you want.
Okay.
The rhythm like this. Watch this. Da-da-da. Da-da-da. Out loud. Okay, now, here's what you do. Once you stand there, shut your eyes, and imagine yourself doing that same dance. You might start humming a little bit. Da, da. As you're doing it, yeah. Okay, now what I want you to do is no thinking, just go do it, quick. Just no thinking, just go serve, yeah. Serve. Fine, don't worry about missing. Keep serving. Don't think. Go, do, quick. That's it.
Down.
Fine, again, don't worry about hitting it.
Down.
Out loud, let's hear it. Out loud, the rhythm.
Down.
There you go. I get them to hum the rhythm of my serve. So they're not thinking, oh, this is what he's doing with his elbow, this is what he's doing with his hands. Out loud, the rhythm.
Down.
There you go. I get them to hum the rhythm of my serve. So they're not thinking, oh, this is what he's doing with his elbow, this is what he's doing with his hands. They're not trying to remember all that. They start humming. And they see themselves doing very similar things, muscular movements, to what I did. But they're not thinking about it, so it just comes out naturally and fluidly. So that didn't take long. That's called serving. Out.
Out.
Don't miss it. Sit. Come. Okay? Okay, that's your first point in tennis. Score is 15 love.
Fantastic. Amazing. Beautiful.
Okay, Molly. No need for you to miss.
All of a sudden, everything became effortless. I was just sort of like floating along, and doing what came naturally, and I said, I'm playing tennis. It's really, really beautiful.
Have a clear idea of what you want. Then let it happen. Don't try too hard. I'm going to try to make you miss, Molly, because it's going on too long. So I'll just get a little bit harder. You just keep watching the ball. Keep watching it. They're rooting for you, Mom. Don't be distracted. Keep on that ball. Oh, Mom, that's fine. That's called tennis.
Well, when I saw that, I said something akin to holy cow, because I'd just seen something that I wouldn't have believed possible, and I realized that it applied very strongly to user interface design, that something really important was going on here. So I got Tim Galway's book, The Inner Game of Tennis, and I read it, and a number of things that he said really stuck in my mind. First one was almost a cliche. He said, learning happens when attention is focused. But he was able to get something out of that, because if you don't have a good theory of learning, then you can still get it to happen by just helping the person focus. One of the ways you can help a person focus is by removing interference. And a lot of what you saw in that tape was a way of holding focus of the mentality that actually had to learn to play the tennis, and removing interference from the mentality that likes to talk and make comments. Another thing that Tim said that's particularly stuck in my mind was, he said that the problem with most theories of teaching is that the parts of the body you want to have learn don't understand English. So the part of your mentality that understands English doesn't play tennis, can't play tennis, can't do mathematics, it can't do music. What it can do is talk and comment. And so in general, for learning most things, it is good to find a way of short-circuiting that mentality that we think of as the I that always tries to take over. And finally, Tim made a very interesting observation, and that is that the problem with being a beginner is that you get a lot of practice in staying a beginner. So if a beginning tennis player most of the time does chase the ball. They get to be really good at chasing the ball, but all other forms of tennis involve hitting the ball. So it's very important for Tim to find a way of catapulting anybody learning tennis, like Molly there, out of the chase a ball stage and instantly get her into hitting the ball stage. So he had to find a way of getting a person who had never picked up a tennis racket before to be able to hit the ball 98% of the time they swung at it. We realized that was an incredibly important principle for user interface design. Why spend 2 weeks trying to read an MS-DOS manual to see how to copy a file or open up an application? Why do any of those things? What do you get from it? Much better to find a way of designing the user interface so that the person who uses it acts like an intermediate from the first time that they sit down. And then they get into a process that is rewarding in itself. Now, these ideas work beautifully for music, and they also apply in cognitive areas very strongly. Here's an example of a programming problem, and that is, let's take the logo turtle and write a program to draw a circle. And we'll do it with 3 ages of people, a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, and a 15-year-old, as representatives from these 3 mentality dominant areas, the body, the visual, and the symbolic. Now the way you get a 5-year-old to do a picture, to do a circle, is something that Seymour Papert learned long ago, and that is you tell the 5-year-old, close your eyes and make a circle with your body. After they've gone part way around, you say, well, what were you doing? And the 5-year-old says, well, I was going a little and turning a little over and over again. If you type that into Logo, you get a perfect circle. And that's because the 5-year-old knows differential equations. Because the circle is a particularly simple thing in differential geometry, which was only discovered about 150 years ago by Carl Gauss. So a circle is that thing that has constant curvature, so the change in curvature is 0. And the child's body mentality, doing mentality, understands that kind of geometry. So the 5-year-old comes up with a very simple program that produces an elegant circle. The 10-year-old has a harder time, because the 10-year-old is visual and really wants to look at things. He doesn't want to do things with his body so much anymore. And so he wants to draw circles with a compass. And after a while, he'll see that by drawing lots of circles, you'll see that the main thing about drawing circles with a compass is that the points on the rim are always the same distance from the center. So his turtle program picks the pen up, starting in the center, jumps out to the rim, goes 100 there, puts the pen down, makes a mark, picks the pen up, backs to the center, turns 1 degree, and does that over and over again. So it's chugga, 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 and you get a perfect circle. Much harder way of doing it, but still a good circle. And of course, I wouldn't be telling this story if the 15-year-old were able to get a circle at all. Because like most adults, he's in the facts and logic stage, and he knows the most horrible fact thought up by the mind of man, which is x squared plus y squared equals r squared. A very bad coordinate system, and even if it were a good coordinate system, it has very little operational significance. So here we see an example of just concentrating on different mentalities in people's skulls, getting vastly different results in doing the program. And surprisingly, the the age levels that are supposed to do less well actually do better. And this led to a slogan I made up, which is that point of view is worth 80 IQ points. So in other words, if you're in 60 BC in Rome trying to multiply two numbers together, you had to be a genius to be able to remember all the partial products that Roman numerals generated. If you're in 1300 AD wondering where Mars is going to go, you had to be a genius to be able to figure out all of the Ptolemaic epicycles. So it's not logic that is powerful. Logic is actually a weak method because it depends on fragile chains of inference. And people have used logic throughout history, but mostly in inappropriate contexts. There's nothing illogical about the way the alchemists or the Babylonians did things. It was that they were in a context in which their logic couldn't do much. So this notion that the context is powerful, and if you want to be able to be good at solving a problem and acting much smarter than you are, then you have to find a context that is going to do most of the thinking for you. Most computer scientists know this because it goes under another heading called choose the appropriate data structure before you start tinkering around with the algorithm. Do the right data structure, it will have most of the result computed almost automatically as part of its inherent structure. And all that reminds me of Edward de Bono's famous comment about American business. I think it probably applies to American universities also. He said the problem with American business is when it gets in trouble, it redoubles its efforts. And he likened this to if you have a bunch of people digging for gold in a certain spot, and they get down 5 feet and they don't find any gold. One of the ways they could do to resolve their problem is to dig twice as hard. And of course, if the gold is 20 feet over to the side, then they can dig all the way to China without finding it out. And the important idea here is that problem solving, all of these things have more than one dimension, and a lot of the important dimensions for doing thinking lie along the lines of these different mentalities. And that led to another slogan which said, well, gee, we don't know how to choose between these Brunerian mentalities. The kinesthetic one is very valuable, knows where things are. The image one is tremendously valuable because it gives you a way of picking things out of a conglomeration very easily. It's quite a bit more efficient to pick an image from a bulletin board than to pick an item out of a linear list of symbols. And the symbolic one, of course, is very powerful given the right context because it can do inferencing that is not open to these other mentalities. So we thought that the right slogan would be, well, gee, why can't we find some way of tying these together? And the way we did it was to say, well, one way of involving the kinesthetic mentality is to give you something to point with. So we have the mouse there not just because it's good to point to the screen occasionally, but because it involves the kinesthetic sense. And the kinesthetic sense is the one that knows where you are. It's the one that locates you in space, not your eyes. Your eyes are an extension of that sense. The image one there is for recognition. Here's a good experiment you can try sometime. Get a friend to manipulate cable television movie channels. Go to a random movie and see how many frames it takes before you can say whether you've seen it before. Think of what that means. You may not have seen this movie for 12 or 15 years, and yet after just a few seconds for most people, you can identify that you've seen this movie and usually be able to remember what comes next. Famous experiment by Harman some years ago took 25 or 30 people, showed them 10,000 images spaced 10 seconds apart. So it took hours and hours to show them all these random photographs of things. And even after 30 days, all of the people in the experiment had better than 90% recall on all of the images. So they could say whether an image was one of the set with 90% probability. They could identify occluded portions in the image. An unbelievable feat is performed by this mentality. Tremendous for creativity in lots of different ways. And then this one is the one that allows you to abstract what you've done concretely there. So all of those things should go together. And that was what we tried to do at Park. So here's one of the first versions of this interface. And this is done by Dan Ingalls, who, after I had invented Smalltalk, was the person who did most of the Smalltalk implementation and then became the major designer of Smalltalk. And this was a crystallization of a lot of the ideas that we had all had culminating around late 1975, around 1976 or so. This is what the Smalltalk user interface looked like. We see collapsed windows up here that, when you clicked on them, would open back up again, clock, multiple applications, and so forth. Larry Tesler, who's now at Apple, had this idea, and this is called the Galley editor, that documents should be able to have different paragraph types. So you might have a paragraph type of text. You might have a paragraph type that's a picture, and that when you put the mouse into the paragraph, it invokes the editor for what's there. And this is a metaphor that I think is going to overtake the cut and paste metaphor that people are used to today, because it's much better in general to always work in the context of the results you're trying to get. We call it results mode interaction. And here's a later version of this principle done by Bob Flegel. Multiple views into the same structure were first done at Xerox PARC by Trygve Rinskaug, a visiting professor from Norway in our group. And he was particularly interested in scheduling. So here is a schedule versus a Gantt chart for looking at the same thing. And you see he selected something here, and the selection shows up here, and it also shows up on this list, and it also shows up down here as a list of names of things. So this idea that what you're actually looking at are different views seen through different filters is something we originally got from Engelbart, but redone in this new form in the multiple window user interface. And here's the way the interface looks today in Smalltalk. And here's just a brief look at what that interface looked like about 10 years ago. So what he's doing is actually entering into sort of like a hyperspace window. He's using a pop-up menu there to get a workspace window. Scrolling is on the opposite side from what you're used to on the Macintosh. And you can see that the scroll arrow is position sensitive. The elevator scrolls you through the text. On Smalltalk, anything that you type can also be executed. So if you just type 3 plus 4 in the editing window or pick up something else, you can say do it, and Smalltalk will go off and do it. Here's the state of the painting program as it was almost 10 years ago. Those are radio buttons that you could actually control your own features. And one of the wonderful things about giving this talk today is that we're almost at the point where I never have to show this movie again, because most of the things that we had done at PARC in this system are now available on powerful micros like the Apple Macintosh 2. I think the final thing I'll show here is this is a browser, a structure invented by Larry Tesler, in which when you point to a category area, it retrieves a bunch of related things. So we're looking at all the different kinds of things that we can do arithmetic on. Picked integer there, looking at the arithmetic part of things you can do to integers, and looking at the operation plus, and here is the code in Smalltalk to do integer plus. And here is an example of the debugger in the system. We'll type in some nonsense. We'll try and add 3 to a piece of text. a piece of text says this is a string. So as we say do it to that, instead of crashing the system, what we'll get is a notification here that the string couldn't transform itself into an integer. And here we can look and see what was going on at that time. So all of the processing that was being done in that thread of control was set aside in Smalltalk. And in fact, once people looked on the disk and found 1,700 suspended processes that were just left there during the debugging of the system. And now by expanding that debugging window, we got a picture of things that were happening in that process quite independently of the processes in Smalltalk that are operating the Windows system and the debugging system. So here's the code that was executing. Here's the attempt of the string to make itself into an integer that failed. It couldn't do that because it couldn't find any numeric characters to transform. And here are the parameters. There's the argument. Self is the thing that got the message, so that's 3. And so we get to see all of the things. We could single step it if we wished. We can restart it if we wished, and so forth. So the whole ideal of what we're trying to do here comes back to this question that I asked in the very beginning, and that is, what would a computer be if it were like a pencil? Can it be used by children? Well, yes, it can. Can it be used by adults? Yes, it can. How low can we go to childhood? Can we go into much lower than grade school? Here's an answer to that question. It's a tape I got from the woman who's my accountant. This is her daughter, aged 22 months, 2 months shy of her 2nd birthday. And she's never lived in a world that wasn't densely populated with Macintoshes, because both her mother and father worked at home, and both of her mother and father had their own Mac. And in fact, when I found out the little girl was interested in computers, I gave her an Apple II, which she rejected. She wanted a Macintosh just like her folks. And she literally learned to use it by sitting on her mother's lap while her mother was working. So for this child, the Macintosh is not a piece of technology, but simply more material in the environment to manipulate. And though I don't believe in user surveys, the one I did do with this very young user is I discovered that she vastly preferred Macintoshes with installed hard disks. Now, given that she can use the mouse, and some people are surprised that she can without having to look at it, but in fact, it's something that everybody can use, it's not too surprising that she can hit visible menu commands in Mac Paint. So when I saw this, I was intrigued. I'd never seen a child this young interacting with a computer before, but I wasn't too overwhelmed until I saw what she did next. She wants a fresh sheet of paper, so she hits the close bar in the window. She saves her old drawing using the pop-up, and then she uses the pull-down to get herself a fresh sheet, and she's off and running again. And in fact, we discovered that she was about 70% literate. About 70% of the generic window commands that are found in any Macintosh application she is able to use, not just in a visual program like Mac Paint. So the answer is that this stuff is for all of us, and the reason it works is not because the goodness of computer science in it, although there is some there. The main reason it works is because for some reason we decided to study human beings and involve lots of human beings called children in our experiment and try and stay closely coupled to them for a number of years. And out of that came a bunch of ideas that could not have sprung just from technology alone. So if it weren't for the multiple mentality ideas of Brune and the catalysis of Tim Galway's Inner Game of Tennis and a host of other sources like Suzuki's way of teaching children violin and others too numerous to mention, we never would have thought of these ideas and implemented them the way we did. I think a good way of ending this talk is with a Winston Churchill joke, which, all Winston Churchill jokes, he's at a party after a certain number of whiskeys, and no matter what happens, he's always in perfect command of the English language. And in this joke, it's rather early in the evening, and he's over in the corner drinking his scotch, and the hostess of the party comes over to him, terribly distraught, and says, "Mr. Churchill, I'm really upset. I just saw a famous earl over here steal one of my silver salt shakers. What am I to do?" And Churchill thought for a minute and stuck his cigar in his mouth and went over to the earl, and on the way he picked up a silver salt shaker and put it in his pocket. And when he got over to the earl, he took it out and said, "I think we've been noticed. Perhaps we should put these back." So the moral of that, besides that being the reason we won World War II, the moral of that story is if you want people to go along with you, you have to involve them in the same conspiracy. And user interface design is a conspiracy that I hope more of you will get interested in. Thank you very much.
I'm Judith Lemon, and our first question is from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Alan, what do you feel about attempts to protect legally fundamental ideas in graphics, especially Apple's attempt to protect the Mac interface, Sutherland's patenting of clipping algorithms?
Well, I think that the basic idea of protecting inventions is something that's been around for a long time, and it has done people who have taken the energy to invent things a fair amount of good. I would like to have 1/10 of a cent for every window that opens on a screen for the next 5 years. But I think that even in patent law, there's enormous confusion between what's an idea and what's an invention. Patent law doesn't allow you to patent an idea, even though nowadays ideas are important as inventions that have been made concrete in some fashion. Also, there's a lot of confusion still in what it means to copyright something. When I was at Atari, the earliest statutes that they used as precedent were things that had to do with copywriting of player piano rolls back in the early 1900s. So it's a very complicated issue. I think that a sort of a first principle in it is if a company spends a lot of money paying people to invent an idea and then comes out with that idea, they should have some protection for it for a while. I don't see any reason why we should condone having those things ripped off. If some company is paying millions of dollars, other companies shouldn't just get it for free. And I think beyond that, the situation is pretty much confused.
This question, Alan, comes from the University of Utah. Where will powerful micros take us? First in 5 years, and then in 10 years?
Well, I think the simple answer is probably not far enough. The basic industry is very conservative. Wall Street wants people to stay with the 86 and 68,000 architectures, which I think is a big mistake. There are lots more interesting things on the horizon, and the amount of computer cycles we actually need to do things, particularly that involve interaction, is always grossly underestimated. So I think that the one answer is that the next 5 years, and especially the next 10 years, could be incredibly interesting. Certainly in the 10-year horizon is the possibility of doing real-time 3D graphics at the flight simulator level on a desktop. I believe that could be done within 5 years if companies took a great interest in it. So we're at a very interesting stage now where the cost performance, as I think everybody realizes, it doesn't go in a steady curve. It goes in jumps and fits because the major cost in a computer is in the packaging. And every time you can get the number of transistors up by a factor of 10, you have an enormous change in whether you can put a thing on a board or whether it requires a rack or an entire case.
Okay. Again, from the University of Utah, computers have not been a big success in direct teaching, for example, computer-aided instruction. Why is this so, and what can be done to improve it?
Well, I think I'm pretty much, after the experience I've had with working with both children and adults with computers and at least dabbling in the areas of learning and education, I think that one of the best ways of thinking of a computer is very similar to thinking of what a piano means in teaching music. And the piano can amplify musical impulse. We can only sing with one voice. If we want to play a four-part fugue, we have to use something mechanical like a piano to do it, and it can be done very beautifully. But for most people, the piano has been the biggest thing to turn millions of people away from music for the rest of their lives. And I think the way to sum it up is just to say that all musicians know that the music isn't in the piano. If it were, we'd have to let it vote. And because of that, that says in any situation where education and learning is involved that you first have to develop a curriculum based on ideas, not on media. The media can be amplifiers of those ideas, but you have to have the ideas first. And I think the reason computers have failed is that almost everybody, no matter which way they try and use computers, have wanted the computer to be some sort of magic ointment over the suppurating wound of bad concepts. And I think as soon as people get what we saw is an amazing learning experience in the Tim Galway tennis experience, and that is something that can extend and be amplified by machines and especially computers. But first you have to have the ideas.
Another University of Utah question.
My old alma mater.
Yes.
Is coming through.
What new developments do you see coming for the disabled?
Well, there I think that's a particular interest of mine because my father was a prostheticist, and something I've been interested in for many years. And I just wish more people were working on it. The technology is there to do an enormous amount for the 10 million aphasics, as an example. I think there are 20 million people in the United States right now who have had strokes. 10 million of them suffer a fair amount of speech impairment. It's quite possible to do technology that they can carry around that allow them to carry on normal conversations about things. Just an enormous set of areas. And I think for people who are interested in user interface, it is another area that gets you out of the McLuhan fishbowl and into a context where you have to go back to first principles and re-examine things. So I think the future there is very bright, but we need more people working in it.
Ellen, whatever happened to Molly?
Molly, yes. Well, it's a wonderful story because after that experience with Tim Galway, she came up, this is in 1975, she came up to him afterwards and said, "Hey, does this stuff work for weight control?" And Tim said, "Well, gee, I don't know. Let's see if we can figure out something." So they figured out something, and Molly, over the next year, took off all of her weight and became a very good intermediate tennis player, and for the last number of years has run an inter-game weight control clinic in Los Angeles. This is a business she set up herself to apply the principles that she'd used to take off all that weight. So this whole experience completely transformed her life. Part of it is she had never thought of herself as being a physical person. She'd never really thought of herself as having a body. And this experience got her in touch with that whole body mentality she'd never been in touch with before, and that's part of the secret of controlling your weight.
Okay, and for the final question, it's two parts. First of all, in terms of increasing human potential, what do you see as the most important challenges for students today?
Well, I think I see going where I felt like when I was in college, elementary school all the way through, except for graduate school, I always felt like a guerrilla warrior, where the major task I had was to retain any sense of myself and my own ideas while I was going through this incredible mill of different hurdles other people had set up. And so I think that's number one. Number two, I think, is for any students who are interested in going into science and the engineering, they have to realize that both of those are art forms, and that both of them are sterile exercises without an aesthetic feeling, and that the liberal arts are the best place to develop your aesthetic feeling. So I'm pretty much even against having strong concentrations in engineering, computer science, and those things at the undergraduate level. I think people should try and get a really solid liberal arts background. And when I mean solid, I mean of the kind that they would call solid on the continent, not in the U.S., and then use that as an endless well for ideas and metaphors that you can use when you're doing science and engineering. I think anybody who's ever read about famous scientists knows that the strongest connection they have with their work is not technical but aesthetic. And so finding the aesthetic in yourself and developing an aesthetic in yourself, I think, is the biggest challenge.
And the last part of the question is, what are you setting as your next challenge?
Well, I think for somebody in their 40s, in a field that's only 40 years old or so, has the challenge of, the basic challenge I think that we all have, but especially as we get older, is the challenge of renewal. Renewal, I think, is a very special word, and I like to use it instead of education. So education has strong connotations, but I think renewal is what it's all about. Renewal means always being able to sidle up to a new problem and try and see it from a fresh point of view. And I find as I get older, it is harder and harder to see things from a fresh point of view. And so for me, the kinds of things I need to do are to, for instance, be able to do more music. I used to be a professional musician and still very interested in it. And I find now that when I have a fair amount of contact with music during the week, that my ideas are fresher in the computer science domain. Otherwise, there's a tendency to just keep on thinking old thoughts and old pathways.
Thank you very, very much. And thank you for joining us today. We invite your comments and questions on this presentation, and we hope that you will make nominations for future speakers and topics. If you're viewing this lecture on tape, we've installed some feedback postcards under the label of the video cassette. If you're not viewing it on tape, our address is at the end of this presentation. Thank you very much.